The sea was calm, shimmering in the rays of the setting sun and barely stirred by the tide. From the breakwater, the whole of Le Havre watched the ships entering the port. From afar, they were clearly visible, and there were many of them. Great steamships shrouded in a smoky haze, and sailing ships with bare masts, like trees stripped of branches and bark, slowly towed by nearly imperceptible tugs. From every point of the horizon, they hurried towards the narrow mouth of the breakwater, which seemed to swallow these giants. And they groaned, roared, and whistled, belching plumes of steam like labor breath. 2 young officers were strolling leisurely along the breakwater, crowded with people out for a walk. They saluted, returned greetings, and occasionally stopped to exchange a few words with an acquaintance. Suddenly, the taller of the two, Paul d'Henrichel, gripped his comrade Jean Renoldi's arm and said in a low voice, "Look, there's Madame Puansot. Take a good look. I assure you, she's making eyes at you." She was walking arm in arm with her husband, a wealthy shipowner, a woman of about 40. She was still very handsome, somewhat stout, but it was this soft plumpness that gave her the fresh bloom of a 20-year-old. Among friends, she was called the goddess for her majestic bearing, her enormous black eyes, and the nobility of her entire appearance. Her reputation was flawless. Not the slightest suspicion had ever clouded it. She was held up as an example of a respectable, unassuming woman, so virtuous that no man would ever dare to dream of her. For a month now, Paul d'Henrichel had been assuring his friend that Madame Puansot was casting tender glances his way. "Believe me, I'm not mistaken," he insisted. "I see it clearly. She loves you passionately, like a chaste woman who has never known love before. 40 is a critical age for sensual but proper ladies. That's when they lose their heads and commit follies. That woman is already smitten, my dear. She is falling like a wounded bird, and she will fall right into your arms. There she is, look." A tall woman was approaching them with her 2 daughters, aged 12 and 15. Upon seeing the officer, she suddenly turned pale. Her gaze, burning and intense, fixed upon him, and she seemed aware of no one else, neither her children, nor her husband, nor the crowd. She returned the young men's bow without shifting her eyes, in which burned such a flame that, for the first time, a doubt crept into Lieutenant Renoldi's mind, and his friend muttered, "What did I tell you? Convinced now? She's still a fine morsel, by Jove." But Jean Renoldi was not at all attracted by society intrigue. He was no hunter of amorous adventures. He sought, above all, peace and quiet, and was content with the casual liaisons that inevitably come a young man's way. The sentimentality, the attentions and proofs of love required by a well-bred woman bored him. However light the chains imposed by such affairs, they still frightened him. He reasoned thus: by the end of the month, I'll be tired of it all, and then I'll have to endure it for another 6 months out of politeness. Moreover, he dreaded the very moment of the breakup, with its inevitable scenes, hints, and the persistence of the abandoned lady. He avoided meeting Madame Puansot, but one evening he found himself seated next to her at a formal dinner, and the entire time he felt upon his face, in his eyes, in his very heart, the scorching gaze of his neighbor. Their hands met, and almost involuntarily clasped in a light squeeze. That was the beginning of their affair. He saw her again and again against his own will. He felt that he was loved, and he gradually softened, seized by a kind of vain compassion for this woman's violent passion. He allowed himself to be adored, remaining merely polite and firmly hoping to maintain the same reserve in his own feelings. One day, she arranged a meeting to, as she said, simply talk. But she suddenly felt faint, fell into his arms, and he perforce became her lover. It lasted 6 months. She loved him with an unbridled, breathtaking passion. Enslaved by this frenzy, she thought of nothing else. She gave him everything: her body, her soul, her reputation, her social standing, her peace of mind. She threw it all into the fire of her heart, as one once threw jewels onto a sacrificial pyre. He, however, had long grown weary of it all, and wistfully recalled the easy conquests of a handsome officer. But he was bound, held fast, feeling like a prisoner. She kept repeating, "I have given you everything. What more do you want?" And he terribly wanted to reply, "But I never asked for anything. I beg you, take back what you have given me." With no care for being seen, slandered, or ruined, Madame Puansot came to him every evening, growing more and more inflamed. She would throw her arms around his neck, clasp him tightly, and lose herself in ardent kisses, which had become torture for him. He would say in a weary voice, "Come now, be reasonable." She would answer, "I love you," sink at his feet, and remain there for a long time, gazing at him with tender emotion. In the end, under this persistent stare, he would lose his temper and try to lift her up. "Do sit down, let's talk." She would whisper, "No, let me be," and continue sitting at his feet in a kind of ecstasy. He said to his friend D. Henrysel, "You know, I'm going to beat her. I don't want this anymore, I don't. It must end immediately." Then he added, "What do you advise me to do?" The other replied, "Break it off." Renoldi shrugged and replied with vexation, "That's easy to say. Do you think one can simply part ways with a woman who torments you with her attention, tortures you with her solicitude, pursues you with her caresses, lives only to please you, and whose only fault is having given herself to me, despite my reluctance?" But one morning, news came. The regiment was being transferred to another garrison. Renoldi was beside himself with joy. He was saved, without scenes, without hysterics, without tears. He just had to endure for 2 more months. Saved. That very evening, she appeared at his door, more agitated than ever. Upon hearing the terrible news, without even removing her hat, she seized his hands, squeezed them tightly, looked him straight in the eye, and said in a trembling yet resolute voice, "You are leaving, I know. At first, I was in despair, but then I realized what I must do. I have no doubts. I am giving you the greatest proof of love a woman is capable of. I will go with you. For you, I will leave my husband, my children, my family. I am ruining myself, but I am happy. It feels as if I'm giving myself to you all over again. This is my final, my greatest sacrifice. I am yours forever." A cold sweat broke out on his back. Inside, he was seething with rage, with impotent fury. But he controlled himself. In a restrained voice, with a hint of tenderness, he rejected her sacrifice, tried to calm her, to reason with her, to explain the sheer madness of her plan. She listened without interrupting, a scornful smile on her lips, her black eyes fixed on him. When he fell silent, she asked, "Can it be that you are a scoundrel? One of those men who, after seducing a woman, abandons her at the first opportunity?" He turned pale and began to reason with her. He spoke of the consequences that would pursue them to the end of their days: shattered lives, society's contempt, closed doors. But she stubbornly replied, "What does any of that matter when one is in love?" And suddenly, he lost his composure. No, I don't want it, hear me? I don't want it. I forbid you. And, breaking down, he poured out everything that had been festering in his soul. Enough, for God's sake. You love me against my will. The only thing left is for me to take you with me. A fine prospect, thank you. She didn't say a word. Her face became deathly pale. A spasm passed over it, as if all her nerves and muscles had contracted, and she left without saying goodbye. That same night, she poisoned herself. For a whole week, she was thought to be lost. Rumors circulated in the city. People pitied her, justified her, by passion. For feelings, driven to an extreme, become heroic, and one forgives what under normal circumstances would be condemned. A woman who takes her own life seems to cease being guilty of adultery. Soon, everyone began to condemn Lieutenant Renoldi for refusing to see Madame Puansot. They said he had abandoned her, been unfaithful to her, even beaten her. The colonel, moved by sympathy, hinted as much to Renoldi himself. Paul de Henrisel came to his friend. Listen, for heaven's sake, you can't drive a woman to suicide. It's base. Renoldi flared up, silenced his comrade for uttering the word base. They fought a duel. To everyone's satisfaction, Renoldi was wounded and lay in bed for a long time. She learned of this and, deciding he had fought because of her, felt an even deeper attachment to him. But, confined to her bed, she never saw him again before the regiment's departure. 3 months passed. Renoldi was now serving in Lille when one morning a young woman, the sister of his former mistress, came to see him. Madame Puansot was dying. Long suffering and despair had broken her. She was doomed. Her last wish was to see him, just once, before closing her eyes forever. Separation and time had quelled Renoldi's anger and satiety. He softened, shed tears, and went to Le Havre. She lay in what seemed a death agony. They were left alone. And then, at the bedside of the dying woman whom he had unwittingly brought to ruin, he was overcome by an unbearable feeling of grief. He wept, covered her with kisses, tender, passionate kisses, unlike any he had ever given her before. He whispered, "No, no, you will not die. You will get better. We will love each other, love, forever." She whispered, "Is it true? You love me?" And he, gripped by despair, swore, promised to wait for her recovery, kissed her emaciated hands, feeling her heart feverishly beating. The next day, he returned to his garrison. 6 weeks later, Madame Puansot appeared at his door again, aged beyond recognition, but even more deeply in love than before. He was bewildered, but he took her in. They began to live together as if they were lawfully wedded spouses. However, the very same colonel who had once condemned Renoldi for abandoning a woman was now outraged by their cohabitation, deeming it improper for an officer who was obliged to set an example. First, he warned his subordinate. Then he became sharp with him, and finally, Renoldi resigned his commission. They settled in a villa on the shores of the Mediterranean, that classic sea of lovers. Another 3 years passed. Her hair had turned gray. Renoldi, resigned to his fate, was enslaved by this persistent love and no longer resisted it. He considered himself a broken man, a lost cause. Hope for the future, dreams of a career, any sense of joy, all of this was closed off to him. Then, one morning, a visiting card was brought to him. Joseph Puansot, shipowner. Le Havre, the husband, the very one who had remained silent until now, understanding that it was useless to fight his wife's hopeless resolve. But why had he come? Monsieur Puansot was waiting in the garden, having refused to enter the house. He bowed politely, declined even to sit on a bench in the alley, and began to speak calmly and methodically. I have come, sir, not to make reproaches. I understand perfectly well how it all happened. A kind of evil fate hung over us, over her. I would never have disturbed your seclusion if not for a change in circumstances. I have 2 daughters, sir. The elder loves a young man, and he loves her. But his family opposes the marriage, citing the situation of my daughter's mother. I bear no malice, no anger, but I love my children, sir. And so I ask you, give me back my wife. I hope she will now agree to return to me, to her home. For my part, I will pretend to have forgotten everything, for the sake of my daughters. Renoldi's heart began to pound violently. He was seized by the rapturous joy of a man condemned to death who is suddenly granted a pardon. He stammered, Yes, of course, sir. I myself, believe me, without a doubt, it is just, perfectly just. He wanted to seize this man's hands, to embrace him, to kiss him on both cheeks. He continued, Please do come inside. You will be more comfortable in the drawing room. I will call her. This time, Monsieur Puansot did not object and took a seat. Renoldi hurried up the stairs, tried to compose himself before the door, and entered his lover's room with an appearance of calm. You're wanted downstairs, he said. It concerns your daughters. She sprang up. My daughters? What has happened? Are they alive? He replied, Yes, but a serious matter has arisen which only you can resolve. She did not wait to hear more and hurried downstairs. Renoldi, agitated, sank into an armchair and waited. He waited for a long time. When angry voices rose from below, he decided to go down. Madame Puansot was in a fury, preparing to leave, while her husband held her by the dress, repeating, Understand, you are ruining our daughters, your own daughters, our children. She answered firmly, I will not return to you. Shocked, Renoldi stepped forward and whispered, What? She refuses? She turned to him and, embarrassed to use the familiar "tu" in her husband's presence, said, Do you know what he demands? He wants me to return to his roof. And she smiled, with boundless contempt for the man who was begging her, almost on his knees. Then Renoldi, driven to despair, resolved to speak in defense of the young girls, the husband, and himself. He spoke fervently, but, having exhausted his arguments, fell silent, searching for new words. At that point, Monsieur Puansot, now hopeless, mechanically reverted to the familiar "tu," an old habit. Listen, Delphine, think of your daughters. She cast a glance full of contempt at them both, and, rushing towards the staircase, cried out, You are both scoundrels. The 2 men were left alone. They looked at one another, equally dejected, equally hollowed out. Monsieur Puansot picked up his fallen hat, brushed the dust from his knees, and, taking his leave of Renoldi, who saw him to the door, said bitterly, We are both very unfortunate men, sir. And he walked away, his steps heavy,